Yeah, thanks. It's a real honour to be able to deliver this 30th anniversary lecture. And what I'm going to try to do tonight, and you will be the judges of whether I'm successful, is to combine a bit of history with a bit of science in terms of global research on trade in reptiles and amphibians. So this talk is going to jump around a bit because the time frames don't necessarily correspond to the time frames in which a logical order, if you think. But anyway, as we know, CITES was founded in the 24th of November 1989, and here we have Jerry and Lee Durrell, and our esteemed founder, Ian Swingland, who's here tonight. We're very pleased to have you here, Ian. You come and support us on all these events, despite being retired for quite some years. I think it was Ian's research really started with research on giant tortoises on Aldabra. And so from the very beginning, there's always been this theme of working on reptiles and more recently amphibians at DICE. And what I'm going to hopefully do tonight is really sort of try and pay tribute to a lot of the people that I've had the privilege of working with over the past 30 years. I think you can only aspire to be as good as the people that you're working with, whether staff or students or associates. And in doing so, I've had to be very, very selective. So I'm going to say a real apology at the beginning that I've had to leave so much out. And I'm going to mention some people, and there's some people I'm not going to be able to mention purely because of lack of time. This talk would originally have gone on till midnight, falling off of your chairs. But anyway, we're in the middle of a general election campaign, and first of all, I should say that any similarity between this cartoon character and any living politician is purely coincidental. But what is interesting about the environment is that one of the probably any positive thing we can say about this current general election is that environmental matters are on the radar. Climate change in particular, and indeed wildlife trade through the Duke of Cambridge and United for Wildlife. So I mean, if reptile and amphibian trade was up there and politicians were shouting about it, these may well be some of the key things that they would be shouting about. It's basically big business. This is a massive business. And even the illegal trade, I think, is what's the fourth biggest crime at a transnational basis, after, I think, it's counterfeiting, human trafficking and narcotics. So there's a lot of money involved with it. There's a lot of people keeping exotic pets. 34% are exotic within the EU. So we're moving away from dogs and cats and hamsters and gerbils and things like that. 21% of this global trade is live reptiles. And I'm only going to talk about the live trade, which in some ways is the tip of the iceberg, because that's less than 10% of the overall trade. The rest of it is in skins and meat, which I'm not even going to go into tonight. Of course, our good friend across the pond would be saying, we can give you a really good deal on reptiles. You leave the EU, we'll give you a good deal. EU, we already get a pretty good deal from the EU. There's about 18% of live reptile imports from the EU. And what we need to understand is the live trade comprises wild, ranched and captive bred animals. What about pets and human well-being? These are animals that are kept as pets, companion animals. And, there's a lot of very good research that actually shows that this is very important for human well-being and health. We get a lot out of our pets. It makes us more human people, it increases our health. Well, that's actually the same for reptiles as well. Reptiles are now regarded as companion animals. And even if you're just an aquarium keeper, there's evidence now that, if you have an aquarium, you can go home and you can relax in front of it, and this will make you a healthier, better person. And the same for terrarium keeping. And terrarium keeping goes back a long way. I'm not sure what that bit of gobbledygook was. It goes back to Victorian times, even if you're just keeping plants. And at DICE, one of our key things, Zoe Davis is here tonight, one of her big research group themes at the moment is human health and well-being and the public engagement of biodiversity. Well, another way people engage with biodiversity is be taking a bit of it and keeping it in their living rooms as well. I'm going to have to touch on CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. This is this big international agreement between governments that oversees international trade of wild animals, and it meets through these meetings, periodically the Conference of the Parties. And really, just to cut a sort of very complex story short, we have Appendix 1 species, which involves trade under exceptional circumstances, and then we have Appendix 2 species, which involves regulated trade. And the way CITES operates is by arriving at quotas. Hopefully, these are quotas that are based on what we call non-detriment findings, that are quotas that can be harvested sustainably, and they oversee the issue of import permits, export permits, and re-export certificates. Now, CITES has its flaws. It's not a perfect instrument, but it also does a lot of good, and one of the good things is that it has a massive database that documents wildlife trade that we can utilise. So there are imperfections there, but overall it does provide us with a lot of good information. So there's a few key questions I'd like to address tonight, which I'm going to go through with, as I say, examples from DICE, trying to collate bits and pieces that we've actually done over the years. I'm going to start with this first one in terms of what are the trends in trade over time. Bit of history. We're going back to a few weeks before DICE was founded, and the first World Congress of Herpetology here in Canterbury that Ian organised. It was the very first time that herpetologists had come together on a global basis. It was such a big meeting, 1,200 delegates, that we didn't have a lecture room here big enough to hold the sessions, and we had to go down to the Marlow Theatre. This is the old Marlow for the plenaries. And it was said that you could hear the croaking as far away as Faversham. And there's one or two important things. I think the First World Congress of Herpetology is known for this is where sort of the current concern about global amphibian declines kicked off. But there was a lot more that happened at the First World Congress. I think it was the first time that conservation of amphibians and reptiles seriously came on the agenda. And wildlife trade and reptiles and amphibians was on the agenda. There's lots of stuff that came out of the First World Congress there. I wasn't actually at DICE here, but you may actually notice somebody looks rather like me down here, in the front row. I was quite young then and operating under the complete naive and incorrect assumption that you need to wear a tie. As I've grown older, I think I've learned that a lot of conservation scientists are actually highly suspicious of people who wear ties. And possibly my career might have advanced a little bit faster than it had done had I not been wearing a tie. In the middle here you can see Ian Swingland and the Durrells, who Jerry Dull gave a fantastic plenary talk at that meeting. And one of the first publications that came out of the very early days of DICE was this edited volume by Ian and his first PhD student, Mike Clemens, The Conservation Biology of Tortoises, in collaboration with IUCN, which was really a document that really made a statement about where we are with tortoises and really touched on a lot of the global trade issues that were happening at that time. Move on a couple of years, 1991. This photograph was taken as a celebratory event for the first cohort of MSc Conservation Biology students. It was a small cohort, and we were operating out of this infamous, rather decrepit bungalow that was demolished, and we had a leaky garage as a laboratory. And I'd like to draw your attention to these two gentlemen on the left who've clearly got to the free drinks before anybody else that particular evening, and particularly the one on the far left, which is somebody called Dr. Andy Smart. And Dr. Andy Smart came here on a postdoctoral fellowship to investigate the UK trade in live reptiles and amphibians. And he was joined a year or so later by this very young man, who is somewhere here in the audience. Here he is up the back, Ian Bride. And they produced this report for a well-known animal welfare charity on the UK trade in live reptiles and amphibians. And I mentioned to Ian a couple of weeks ago, have you got a copy of this report? We couldn't find it. And eventually we managed to unearth it. And it's the first time we both looked at it. And there's a lot of good stuff in here. It's the first time that really the legislation was looked at. It's the first time there's been good quantitative analysis of what was going on in terms of imports and exports. There was a school survey about what kids were keeping. And there was a pet shop survey of welfare and numbers and all these sorts of things like this. This was a time when Teenage Ninja Turtles was very, very popular. And one of the things the report highlights is the issues concerning turtle keeping, because there was this massive boom in red-eared slider terrapins and others from other parts of the world, which caused a lot of problems with them being released, and probably still are being released into the wild. I've included these two graphics for sort of museum piece graphics, I'd like to say. I don't think Excel existed in those days, so I'm not sure what Ian and Andy produced these on, but this was regarded as the height of technology back in 1993. And this is just one of the bits of information I think is quite interesting, because they managed to get hold of these trade lists from the 1940s and the 1950s and looked at them more recently. And actually there's not a vast amount of change. The snakes are very, very popular. Tortoises and chelonians are quite popular. Amphibians haven't really changed much, and so on. I think what these figures hide is the vast increase in the volume of numbers of animals that are actually coming through here. Back in the 1940s and 50s, I think it was a small group of rather eccentric people that were keeping amphibians and reptiles. It wasn't the massive industry that we actually see now. I'm going to jump ahead a few years to probably about 2005, when on our MSc course came this very young, quiet, diffident chap called Ben Tapley, who did a wonderful MSc project, and Ben is now the curator of amphibians and reptiles at ZSL. And what we said to Ben is, take these lists that we got back from the 90s and see what's changed. Go on the internet and look at the pricing and what's actually changed. And between 93 and 2005, the number of species in the trade actually doubled. And what was more intriguing, that only about a third were common to both of these periods. So there is this dynamic. What people are keeping and buying is changing over time. It's increasing, but the species that they're interested in are changing over time. And also there was a general increase in price, above inflation, but wide variation between species. And what was most interesting is that unusual colour morphs had increased in price by over 1,000%. So there'd been a lot of emphasis on breeding albino, all sorts of interesting colour morphs, which are becoming very, very popular. So, I mean, to my mind, producing a giant snake that looks like an enormous earthworm isn't really a very useful, well, it's completely, doesn't do any good for conservation and produces things that, to my mind, are not very attractive. But there's a sector out there that loves doing this, and it commands very, very high prices. Angus Carpenter, who wasn't actually a student here, but he collaborated with us on a lot of work in Madagascar, and we did this joint paper in 2014, did an interrogation of the CITES data and looked at the numbers of individuals reported being imported through CITES. And there's three species on here. This grey line shows the axolotl, which sort of bumps along the bottom. And the axolotl is widely used in medical work and in pet shops and hasn't changed much. But if you look at these two very colourful species, the dart-frogged Dendrobates and the golden mantella, they really hardly featured in the 1980s. And then there was a massive boom when there were lots and lots of individuals that were wild caught and imported, and then it actually died off, sort of in the new millennium. And this follows a common pattern with a lot of species, in that they're brought into captivity and they're very, very popular, and then people start breeding them very, very effectively, and captive breeding starts meeting the market, so the demand for importing them from the wild starts to decline. Reptiles, and here we've got the work of Janine Robinson, who's one of our prize-winning PhD students. I think Jinx is here somewhere, but she won the RSPB Conservation Prize for the best PhD, effectively the Oscar for conservation PhDs in Britain. Very, very well deserved. And this is part of Janine's work that really showed a very similar pattern from the CITES database, that there is an overall decline in trade. And just to put some sort of familiar pictures on this is green iguana, this is raw python, and we're seeing this general decline up to about 2012. And really what this represents is a decrease in wild-caught animals and an increase in ranched and captive bred animals within countries. Some of these are ranched in the countries of origin, but a lot of these are actually captive bred in the countries where they're actually sold. And then these are some EU figures which Chris Newman actually provided for me a few years ago, because EU data is much trickier to get hold of, but shows a very similar pattern. This isn't species specific, but if you look at non-CITES species, there's generally been a decrease over the years of imports into the EU. So there's been a shift away from wild caught to captive bred. So, and a lot of people think, yeah, I'm going to keep captive bred because it's much more ethical, I'm not having any impact on wild populations, often captive bred animals are healthier, they sometimes live longer, and so on. So, is this a good thing? Well, it might seem like a good thing superficially, but if you are dealing with species where people's livelihoods depend on sustainable use of those animals in the home countries, then it may not necessarily be a good thing. And this is something I'm going to come on to look at a little bit later. So what is the status of populations that are harvested for the trade? So this, we've done a lot of work on this, and it's quite basic. It's going out to try and do population assessments of certain key species that are in the trade. I mean, people often ask me, what do I do at DICE? I say I spend a lot of time wandering around in Wellington boots, counting things, bringing them back and trying to get our statisticians to make sense of it. It's not really rocket science, but it's crucially important if you're involved with the trade, because you need to look at things like impact on the wild. And if we look at chameleons as a case study, we spent quite a lot of time working on chameleons. These are a fascinating group because they're in big demand within the trade. There are 94 species of chameleons in Madagascar. They are all endemic, and this compares to, I think it's about 215 species globally. And they have amazing morphology, amazing life histories, and they're in quite big demand. So we thought looking at the chameleons of Madagascar would be an interesting case study to tackle some of these topics. And we've been doing this on and off since about 1995. Back in 1995, I was involved with our first Darwin project, which was biodiversity management training in 3 African countries, Madagascar, Tanzania, and what was then Zaire. And when we went to Madagascar, I went there to Madagascar for the very first time to look at capacity building exercises. And I met someone who was very, very helpful, who was running the Madagascar Wildlife Conservation Society program, who was Matthew Hatchwell, who is now our DICE Advisory Board Chairman. So it's interesting how things that go round and come around. So thank you very much, Matthew, for all those help you gave us years and years ago. Well done. And then we went on, and we've been very lucky with Darwin that we produced a whole range of projects that we've been looking at chameleons. And this has been largely led by this chap in the middle, Lee Brady there with the rather ridiculous sunglasses on, who's here somewhere tonight. And effectively, Lee was spending 3 months in Madagascar and 3 months back here, basically running teams like this, doing surveys. And it wasn't just surveys, it was a lot of local community work, a lot of capacity building, and a lot of CITES related stuff. Working in Madagascar is interesting. You have long, hard drives on terrible roads, interesting modes of transport, and when you finally get to your destination, you're usually hot, thirsty, absolutely gasping for a cup of tea, to the extent that you subconsciously start behaving like a teapot. So a good cup of tea in Madagascar is quite hard to find. You then go and make camp somewhere that seems like the end of the earth. It's usually raining because it rains very, very hard. You have to have these tarpaulins over your tents to keep the rain off. And when the sun comes out, everybody in the tents rushes out and tries to get all their smalls dry on the washing lines because everything is soaking wet and the sunshine doesn't last for very, very long. So these are the sorts of places we used to work from, and during the day we used to go and set up transects. So here's a team running a transect through the forest, and it turns out that chameleons are fantastic models for a method called distance sampling, because chameleons just sort of sit there and you can go up to them and photograph them, and you can measure the distances from the transect very, very easily. And you know, here's a chameleon, you know, fantastic animals. I can only describe them as that at night they always look as if they're a little bit worse than we're for drink. You know, they tend to sit there and you go up and you measure them, and they have these weird eyes, these bulbous eyes, and what's going on? And they start looking at you, you know, this one's got bloodshot eyes, probably not head before. And then if you should disturb them, they sort of start trying to stagger away. And then if you pick one up, it sort of continues to sort of go like this, you know. And they have personalities like this, but it makes them fantastic because they're so easy to work with, you know. And a lot of other reptiles, you spend most of your time trying to catch the damn things, and when you do catch them, they tend to bite you or they run away or things like this. Chameleons are amazingly laid back, and they're fantastic for using this distance sampling methodology, which allows you to calculate population densities very, very well. So this is the most boring slide in the presentation, which shows data. So we produced lots of sort of boring publications in rather tedious journals. This was one of the better papers published in the days when biological conservation used to publish stuff on species. They don't seem to do that anymore. But this really wasn't the point. Getting these papers out wasn't really the point. What we really wanted to do is to get this information into the decision-making processes so it can influence things like quotas and harvesting. And round about the mid-90s, we were commissioned by IUCN to do a status assessment report of chameleons in Madagascar. And this was commissioned by this lady, Alison Rossa, who, is she here tonight? No, she's not here tonight, I don't think. But Alison Rossa was working for the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, and a few years later we managed to prize her away from that, and she came to DICE and started the MSc in Conservation and International Wildlife Trade, and ran that very, very effectively and very, very efficiently for a number of years. So lots of you who are on the Wildlife Trade Programme have a lot to thank Alison for back in, I think it was 2007 when she did that. So we produced this report, which was designed to influence decision makers. And we also said, well, we'd like to run a workshop to do chameleon red listing, a reptile assessment for chameleons. And then a lot of the other people in Madagascar said, well, we'd like to do this for all of the reptiles. And we thought, well, wait a minute, there's nearly 100 species of chameleons, and there's hundreds of species of reptiles. They said, no, we're going to do it for all of the reptiles. So we got together, they put us in a hotel in Antananarivo, and for 3 days we did this blitzing through the red listing of all the Madagascar reptiles. And I'd like to point this chap out to you here. This is Richard Jenkins, who was a postdoc employed on the Darwin Project, and we seconded Richard to Madagascar to run the NGO that was overseeing this. So you see the logo up there, Madagascar Advocacy. That was the NGO that Richard was director of for a number of years. He obviously hadn't learnt yet that you didn't need to wear a tie at these events, but it certainly did him no harm because he's now director of the IUCN programme in Cambridge, and doing very well there following on from his time in Madagascar. So here we are, these events, you sit around the table, you blitz through data, you look at data, you play around with things, Here's Lee wondering when the coffee's going to arrive. And eventually you come up with a status assessment for the Malagasy chameleons. And this is all blitzed through, as I say, in a very short period of time. So just as an example, this is one chameleon, first in Campani, very attractive species that there was some pressure on to look at whether there could be sustainable harvesting. And on the basis of that data, there was a new quota of 250 derived in 2012. Just about a week ago, our Madagascar partners contacted us and said, we'd like to go back to the areas where first the Campani is and do a comparison between the areas where they're harvesting and with the areas that are totally protected. And we thought, what a fantastic idea. That's a real sort of good way to try and follow up on this and to try and nail whether this quota is effective, whether the harvesting is effective, and how it actually compares to natural populations. Okay, moving on to this sticky question. Can a sustainable trade benefit local communities and create incentives? So we did all this work on chameleons, and we worked on getting quotas, and we thought about, yes, well, there's obviously possibility of people earning incomes from doing this on a legal basis. How sustainable is this? And this really goes back to the fantastic work that Janine did in her PhD, because she went out to Madagascar and worked in this area called Moramanga, where she explored the trade chain. And effectively, this is the trade chain. You have local collectors, and they will pass on to intermediaries, who will pass on to exporters. So we got a good handle on the number of households that are involved, the intermediaries, the registered exporters, and so on. And as part of this work involved going around visiting exporters. So this is one of the exporter facilities. They're often not great in terms of animal welfare and animal management. And we also did a lot of education work. It went beyond just getting information out of them. This is Raffaele, who's a member of our Madagascar team. He's now head of the HERT team in Madagascar. And we did a lot of work with them in terms of helping them to identify species and also public education. This is an export facility that also serves as a sort of a little zoo as well. And this is quite interesting. This is some of the data that Janine came up with. And if you look at these prices here at the bottom, and this is based on an average of about 24 species that these communities gain. So on average, the local collector gets about 28 cents per reptile. An intermediary gets about $1.49, and the exporter gets about $19.42. But of course, your exporters have to put in a lot more investment. They have to run facilities, they have to maintain the animals, they have to pay the people to actually go out. So when you separate this out into profit and cost, which Janine did in conjunction with Ian Fraser in our economics department, you get a graph like this. And you can see that although exporters are costing more, they're also making a pretty hefty profit on those exports that they're making. So if you come down to the local collector's end, there's only about 5% of households are engaged in amphibian and reptiles for the trade. Overall, this works out at about $100 per season. But this is perceived as a very part-time, risky, and financially unreliable source of income. And if you ask the local people, would you go out and collect more animals than you actually need, they said, well, there's absolutely no point because there'd be no buyers for them. So ultimately, there seem to be fairly low incentives for stewardship of species and habitats based on this trade structure, because the local collectors are really not making a vast amount of money out of it. I'm going to jump on a bit and look to the issue of disease. This is a pressing question. Are diseases transmitted by the trade? And I'm sure that we've all come across the stories of frog die-offs with this disease that comes under the mouthful of Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis, which is killing off frogs around the world. This is in the Sierra Nevada in North America. There's the famous film that David Attenborough took of the Panamanian golden frog that was utilised in Life in Cold Blood series and not long after that filming was completed, these frogs started dying off as well. We know a fair bit about this fungus. It's an apotic fungus that has spores that are picked up on the skin and encyst in the skin, and we think that effectively, for many species, they actually die from organ failure rather than anything else. And it seems to be a disease pretty much in wet areas, often highland areas as well. But the figures are quite stark. It's been estimated there's over 500 species of amphibians that are affected by BD, and probably getting on for 100 species that may have actually been driven to extinction simply because of disease. What's the position in Britain? Well, we've done a lot of population ecology work in Britain, and for a long time I've been working with this guy, who is Trent Garner, who is a professor of wildlife disease at Zoological Society of London. But he does have another job, which is working behind the bar at the Zoological Society of London Staff Club, which actually no longer exists, for reasons that we won't go into. But the Staff Club at the Zoological Society of London was an amazing place to actually get new things going in conservation. All sorts of people used to go there, lots of interesting ideas happened over a beer. And I was sitting in the staff club with Trent probably 12, 15 years ago, and he said to me, "You're doing the population biology, we're doing the disease, we can clean up on this, buddy." He's a big Canadian guy, larger than life, and very, very engaging and very, very persuasive. And I wasn't sure about it. I thought, I'm not really sure I want to get into disease work. It's not something that I've got any expertise in. But he says chytrid will happen in Britain, and it will happen big time. What we knew around about that time is that there was one case of chytrid, not very far from here, in 2004, at a series of ponds on the Kent-Sussex border where it was actually picked up. And persuaded by Trent, we took some swabs and we started having a look. Now, there's probably some people in the audience here doing DI-836, the survey and monitoring module. And what we did in 2007 was go around to some ponds on campus, and we swabbed a number of amphibians for chytrid. And out of that undergraduate field course, we came up with a chytrid positive site, only the second one in England. Those of you who know the campus, it's up by Woodies. Woodies Culvert is the pond. And lo and behold, we detected chytrid. I remember getting the email from Trent that says, "Congratulations, buddy, you've got chytrid." Thanks, Trent, that's really what I wanted to know. But it just shows you what can come out of undergraduate work. Around about the same time, up here in the northwest of England, it was found in some natterjack ponds as well. So these are the first three sites in the country. Interestingly, these three sites had one thing in common with them all: non-native species. This site on the Kent-Sussex border was a bullfrog, had American bullfrogs that was subject to an eradication programme. The pond at Woodies had non-native alpine newts, and the ones up in Cumbria, we found out that the toads had been reintroduced and they'd come into contact with European tree frogs. So interestingly, it made a connection between the presence of chytrid and non-native species and possibly the trade. So Trent then said, we've got to follow this up. Where's it coming in? Is it coming in shipments? And we then got this rather crazy PhD student called Emma Wombwell. I think she's dressed as a frog there. That's true. It looks like someone trying to perform humane euthanasia. And Emma was she was a tough cookie. And effectively, with our friends at Heathrow, we got our friends at Heathrow to screen all the shipments of amphibians that were coming in. So is this an issue? What's coming in? And lo and behold, we found BD present in about 12% of consignments and 3.6% of amphibians. So not all of the individuals in a consignment are infected, and not all the consignments are infected. So we looked at this and said, well, this is getting quite interesting. What happens when they go from Heathrow into the trade chain? When they go down the trade chain into the wholesalers, into the pet shops, into the homes. So first of all, Emma looked at where things were coming from. I always think if you look at the wildlife trade literature, it's full of maps like this. I always think these are maps that almost look like an atlas has been given to a chimpanzee with a set of coloured pens. It's gone like this. But you can see here that there's a big chunk of stuff coming in from the USA, and the red lines indicate where the chytrid is coming from. And we found that there were 12 countries involved here, chytrid coming from 2 of them, and the numbers of animals per consignment varied. But interestingly, a lot of those animals passing through the Heathrow reception centres were being re-exported. So not only animals potentially coming in with chytrid, they're being re-exported to other areas. So this is a slightly more flattering picture of Emma. And we said to Emma, well, you've got to really follow this possible disease pathway through the trade chain. And this has involved going around to lots of pet shops, doing lots of swabbing, chatting up lots of pet shop owners, getting them on your side. It's going to be quite a task. And I remember Emma said to me, well, yeah, I'm up to that, she said, and I've got a very good undergraduate research assistant to help me. So, and I remember saying to her, well, are you sure an undergraduate will be up to something of this magnitude? It involves, complex sampling, lots of talking to owners and some lab work. And she said, yeah, I think it will be fine, because the undergraduate in question is actually my younger brother, who's actually recently started at university, and he knows what I'll do to him if he messes up. Now, that isn't a direct quote, because this is a pre-watershed lecture, and I removed some expletives from that Emma actually stated. But through this combination of, I think, charm, persistence, and intimidation of her little brother, she managed to get some very interesting data on what was going on through the trade chain. And we see, yes, indeed, it does go down here, different percentages, 17% of shops, 6% of the vary in shops, and overall, about 6% of amphibians within the shops will be carrying chytrid. So this seemed to be a possible link as to how it can actually get out into the wild. So the big question is it a problem? And here I think we've got lucky in the UK, because for British native species, BD isn't a massive problem. It just so happens that the species we have can be infected, but they won't necessarily suffer in any big way, and they won't necessarily die from it. So, and that's purely because of the species that we actually have here. Now, one of the reasons Trent got me involved with, because we were doing this long-term population work, and as you know, we've been looking at newt populations for about 20 years, and every week we go out and take photographs of the individuals so we can individually identify them. After the lecture tonight, there's a number of people in the audience who'll be going out, catching newts and doing exactly this. So, and all of our newts have names, so we know them individually. So does anybody know which that male newt is?
It's not Howard.
Not Howard, no. It's a slightly unfair question, because it's one you might not have seen in recent years. But it's what we often say is the most famous newt in the world is Clint. It's easily identified by that rather sad face and a zit on his chin. And that one is Marilyn. And Clint was actually one of our longest lived newts. We haven't seen him for about 3 or 4 years, but he was at least 14 years old, and he was chytrid positive. And he wasn't too worried about it, and clearly Marilyn wasn't too worried about it. So we have chytrid in the population, but it doesn't seem to be effective. Now, I should say, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried, because chytrid is a funny beast. It exists in different lineages and different strains, and it can evolve rapidly. And the strain that we have in Britain, at the moment, doesn't seem to be affecting native species, but there can be subtle changes in the environment, there can be changes on an evolutionary basis that will change it. What is even more worrying is that in about 2013, a new species of chytrid was discovered on the continent, that had a very detrimental effect on salamanders and newt. A new species. It wasn't Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis, it's another one, Batrachochytrium salamandrivorans. And this is a species that was wiping out salamander populations, and it's tested and it will kill newts as well. So at the moment, we're waiting with bated breath about, is this going to be an issue in Britain? What we do know is that it has been found in captive populations in Britain. So far, touch wood, it hasn't been found in any wild populations. So if it did get into wild populations, then yes, the outcomes could be rather worrying. Anyway, where are we going? I'm going to try and wrap this all up quite quickly, tackling the problems. A lot of what I've talked about is to do with supply and demand. And I think if you're looking at wildlife trade issues, you need to look at both ends. And if we look at the supply end of things, we're interested in looking at impact on wild populations, socio-economic drivers, livelihoods, legislation, and enforcement. These are the key things that we need to look at if we're going to try and address issues there. If you look at the demand end, what do people want to buy, then I think there's a need for education, increasing biosecurity, greater emphasis on invasives and disease, and legislation and enforcement. Now you might see that legislation and enforcement occurs in both of these lists. And a lot of people will say, well, why don't we just ban the trade, stop it, and then we won't have any of these problems. It's an idea politicians like, policymakers like, because it seems so simple. This is a very interesting graph study done by Allison and also Nigel Leader Williams when he was director of DICE. And Nigel is up the back here tonight, so it's good to see you here, Nigel. I often think this lecture's almost becoming like I'm comparing This Is Your Life. And we're here tonight. Anyway, probably a lot of people too young to remember This Is Your Life. But anyway, Nigel and Allison did this very nice analysis that showed what happens before and after a CITES trade ban. And it can jog along, and then you bring in a ban, and then there's a massive upsurge in trade because everyone's trying to get things done before the ban comes in. And then it drops a bit, and then it actually levels off. So you can actually have a ban that would actually stimulate trade in a short-term basis. I also think there's a massive problem with a ban, and it would be completely unenforceable. You know, at the moment, tragically, we cannot regulate human trafficking and people are dying being brought over from the continent. So do you think we're going to have the enforcement mechanisms to see if there's a few frogs in the back of a car? It's just not going to happen. So I think I have enormous issues with bans, and I tend to agree with this. Another thing about Nigel is that he always remembers the date of the foundation of DICE because his birthday is on the 24th of November, and on Sunday he will be 70 this year, so many congratulations. So anyway, I just found this cartoon because I thought it looked like a herpetologist. What can we conclude? Well, generally imports of amphibians and reptiles are decreasing, and there's this massive increase in country captive breeding. The diversity of the species in trade is increasing, but it actually changes. One of the things is that the benefits from the trade are not equally shared, and local communities may not benefit significantly from the legal trade. And this means that based on our Madagascar study, which I emphasise is not necessarily representative of everything going on, the incentives to conserve habitats are relatively low. Emerging diseases are related to the trade, and we should continue to be concerned about those. And certainly it's a bit of a hot topic, but personally I don't think bans are likely to work. What next? Well, we're in the process of forming the DICE Wildlife Trade Research Hub, which has been put together by Dave Roberts and Janine. I haven't actually mentioned Dave, but Dave he's like our sort of the ideas factory of wildlife trade. He has these multidisciplinary radar that goes around the university and finds people working in history and computing and maths and can actually sort of draw on them to involve them in some really interesting wildlife trade research. There's a lot of stuff going on, consumer preferences and economic drivers. If we can analyse what it is that people find attractive about things like this, colourful frogs and colourful chameleons, can we make predictions about what the next big thing will be in terms of the demand, in terms of consumer preferences, so we can sort of head things off. So that's an interesting one that really draws on social science methods. Dave's also into cybercrime and techie solutions. This lizard here has the interesting name, I think it's the Madagascar satanic flat-tailed gecko. But something that we're looking at here is, again, working with our colleagues in engineering and digital arts who work on security systems and iris pattern recognitions. If you photograph the eye of a lizard, is that individually identifiable? And you can keep that with a CITES permit and recognise the animals from capture in the wild through to the final arrival on the end state. Work in progress. Lots of interesting diseases coming out. Steve Allain is working on snake fungal disease, which we know is in Britain. We don't know very much about it, so watch this space. We don't know if it's trade related, but it certainly seems to be getting a lot more interest. And I think there's a lot more interesting beasts out there that we need to keep an eye on in terms of the trade, and so there's a lot more potentially interesting work to do. Thank you very much for your attention. There's one other very important announcement I'd like to make, and that is, probably some of you are wondering where our esteemed Director of DICE, Bob Smith, is this evening, and also where our wonderful Head of School, Tracy Kibble, is tonight. They are actually at a very important event in London, at this place, where it gives me enormous pleasure and pride to reveal that this evening it was announced that a recipient of the Queen's Anniversary Prize for Higher and Further Education goes to the Durham Institute of Conservation and somebody's hand, I better shake your hand. Let's shake Ian's hand, getting us where we are, and Matt's hand for your fantastic stewardship. And Annabelle and Bob and Alexandra and the whole team put a lot of effort into getting this bid off the ground, and it's fantastic to see that it's happening tonight, of all nights.
And we've got a live thing from the Queen now. We're just going to... It's too good, isn't it? It just gets... Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.